The chief surgeon pointed at her like she was furniture. "Get her out of my trauma bay." Emily Brooks didn't flinch. She set her badge on the counter, slow, deliberate, and walked out of Redwood Valley Medical Center with every eye in that hallway burning into her back. 31 years old, former Army combat medic, 3 deployments, a decade of keeping soldiers alive in the dirt with nothing but her hands and whatever was left in her kit, and they threw her out for insisting a dying man needed help. 40 seconds later, the windows shook. If you're watching this right now, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Like it, follow along, and don't you dare leave before the end. The morning had started the way most of Emily Brooks's mornings started. Badly, and too early. She'd been awake since 4:30, not because she had to be, but because her body still hadn't figured out that she wasn't in the Army anymore. 3 years out of uniform, and her nervous system still treated 0430 like a summons. She'd made coffee in her apartment above the laundromat on Clover Street, watched the Stonehaven fog press against the window glass, and thought about nothing in particular. That was its own kind of skill, the ability to sit inside a quiet morning without letting the other mornings crawl back in. She drove to Redwood Valley Medical Center in the gray pre-dawn. The hospital sat at the edge of town like it was trying to hold the mountains back, a blocky complex of glass and pale concrete that managed to look both too large for Stonehaven and not large enough for everything that came through its doors. Montana winters had a way of generating trauma at volume, car wrecks on black ice, hunting accidents, falls in places where nobody would find you for 3 days. Emily had come to understand the ER here as a kind of controlled chaos, predictable in its unpredictability, which suited her fine. She had been a travel nurse for 14 months. Stonehaven was her 3rd placement. She didn't accumulate much. A duffel bag of clothes, her field kit she kept under the bed out of habit, a photograph of her squad tucked behind her driver's license in her wallet. She kept the photograph because it reminded her of something she didn't have a clean word for. Not pride, exactly. More like proof. Proof that she had once been part of something that mattered past the paperwork. The ER at Redwood Valley ran on a particular social architecture. The attending physicians were gods. The charge nurses were lords. The travel nurses were guests who were tolerated as long as they didn't draw attention to the things the permanent staff preferred not to examine too closely. Emily had learned this fast. She did her job, she didn't make noise, and she clocked out without drama. That was the agreement, unspoken but absolute. Dr. Marcus Hale was the chief of trauma surgery at Redwood Valley. He was 52, silver-haired in the way that photographed well, and he moved through the hospital with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told he was wrong by anyone whose opinion he respected. He'd trained at Johns Hopkins, completed his fellowship in Seattle, and arrived in Stonehaven 6 years ago to what he called, at fundraising dinners and in interviews with the Regional Medical Journal, serving a community that needs real expertise. He was not an incompetent surgeon. He was, however, a man who confused credentials for judgment, and that was a different kind of dangerous. Emily had crossed paths with him exactly twice before this morning. Both times, he'd looked at her badge, looked at her face, and looked away. Travel nurse. Not worth cataloging. She was halfway through a chart update at the nurses' station when the ambulance bay doors burst open. The paramedics came in fast, 2 of them, 1 on each side of the gurney, clipping through the automatic doors with the focused economy of people who'd been moving hard for 20 minutes and weren't done yet. The patient on the gurney was male, large, his clothes already cut away. He was unconscious. His face was partially obscured by trauma dressing that had been applied in the field, and there was heavy bruising across his left jaw and orbital socket that suggested blunt force impact rather than a simple accident. But it was the wound pattern that stopped Emily mid-step. She wasn't supposed to be the one who picked up this case. The triage nurse on duty was Sandra, who was competent and experienced, and the attending on call was Dr. Reeves, who was neither exceptional nor terrible. The system would sort this patient the way it sorted all patients. Emily should have kept her eyes on her chart. She didn't. She walked to the gurney, not quickly, not in a way that announced itself. She just moved in that direction, the way she'd learned to move toward things that required attention before the situation required it out loud. She looked at the man's torso. The field dressing was holding, but she could see from the saturation pattern that the source of bleeding was deeper than the surface wound suggested. She looked at the contusion along his ribs. She looked at the specific positioning of the bruising near his left flank and the way his color sat wrong, not pale in the standard shock presentation, but with a dusky undertone that meant something particular was happening with perfusion. She had seen this before, not in a hospital, in a valley in a country she was not going to name, in a hallway in Montana. "He needs a thoracic assessment right now," she said. Not loudly. She said it to Sandra the way she might say the IV line is kinked, factual, not dramatic. Sandra looked up from the intake tablet. "I've got it, Emily. His hemodynamics are going to drop in the next 4 minutes. He needs imaging and a surgical team in the trauma bay before that happens. Emily, look at the bruising distribution. That's not soft tissue. That's internal." "I said I've got it." Emily stepped back. She wasn't going to fight with Sandra. Sandra was doing her job. The problem was that Sandra hadn't seen what Emily had seen, and what Emily had seen wasn't something you learned from a textbook. You learned it from watching men bleed out in places where the nearest surgical suite was a cargo plane and a prayer. And even then, sometimes you lost them and sometimes you didn't. And the difference was usually about the first 4 minutes. She went back to her chart. She watched the gurney move into triage. She checked the clock. She tracked the time. 3 minutes later, she walked to the trauma bay. Well, Dr. Hale was already there. He'd been pulled in from his office. She could tell because he had the slightly irritated energy of a man interrupted mid-something. He was reviewing the field medic's notes with the attending while Sandra ran the initial vitals assessment. There were 2 other nurses in the room, plus a resident who looked like he'd been awake for 30 hours. Emily stepped to the side of the gurney and looked at the monitor. The blood pressure read was already trending down. Not crashed, trending. There was a window here, and it was closing. "He's got a hemothorax developing," she said. "Possibly splenic involvement. The rib bruising on his left flank." Dr. Hale turned. He looked at her the way you look at a sound you can't immediately identify. "Excuse me?" "The bruising pattern, the saturation rate on the field dressing. His pressure is dropping faster than a straightforward chest wall injury would account for. He needs a chest tube and imaging, and if his pressure drops another 10 points before you get him to a surgical suite, you're going to be behind this." There was a pause in the room. Not a comfortable one. Dr. Hale handed the chart back to the attending. He looked at Emily's badge. He looked at her face. "You're a travel nurse," he said. "Yes." "This is my trauma bay." "I understand that." "Then I'm not sure what's happening right now." He said it without raising his voice, which was somehow worse. "You're not on this case. You have not been assigned to this case, and you're standing in my trauma bay telling me how to treat a patient." "I'm telling you what I'm seeing." "You're a nurse," he said. The word landed the way he intended it to. "You are not a diagnostician. You are not a surgeon. Whatever you think you're seeing," he made a small dismissive gesture toward the monitor. "Sandra is running a proper assessment. That is the protocol. That is the system, and you're interrupting it." Emily kept her voice level. "His pressure is going to crash. If you'd like to continue working in this hospital, I'd suggest you return to whatever chart you were updating and let the people with the appropriate qualifications do their jobs." "With respect, Dr. Hale, I wasn't asking for your respect." He turned to the security staff standing near the bay entrance, a man named Garrett, who Emily had said good morning to for 6 weeks, and who now had the expression of someone who wished he were somewhere else. "Please escort this nurse out of the trauma bay." Garrett moved. He was apologetic about it, at least. "You're done here," Hale said to her back. Emily stopped at the counter. She picked up her badge, the Redwood Valley Medical Center ID that Sandra had swiped her into the building with that morning, and she set it on the counter. Not thrown, not slammed. She placed it there, and she turned, and she walked out. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't look back at the patient on the gurney, because she'd already memorized everything about him that she needed to. In the hallway, she stopped. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes for approximately 2 seconds. She had recognized him. Not his name. She'd never known his name. In the field, they weren't always names. They were positions, call signs, vital signs. He had been a critical evacuation case on her second deployment. A man who came in from an operation that nobody was allowed to document, and she had worked on him for 11 minutes in the back of a vehicle that wasn't supposed to exist, and she had kept him alive long enough to get him to the forward surgical team, and then she had gone back to her unit and filed a report that had been immediately classified, and she had never heard another word about it. He was older now. The beard was different. There was more damage on his face. But the bone structure, the specific way his left shoulder sat slightly higher than the right from an old injury she remembered dressing, it was him. She didn't know what he was doing in Stonehaven, Montana. She didn't know what had happened to him, or who had done it, or why. She knew 3 things. He was alive, he was critical, and Marcus Hale did not understand what was wrong with him. She was standing in the hallway outside a trauma bay, holding none of her credentials, and she was the only person in this building who did. She thought about calling someone. She pulled out her phone. She thought about who she would even call. Her former CO had retired. Her unit had dispersed. She had a number in her phone that was labeled only with a first name she hadn't dialed in 2 years. She was still looking at the phone when the windows shook. It wasn't an earthquake. She knew that immediately. She'd been in earthquake country before, and earthquakes had a different quality, a rolling subsurface movement that you felt in your feet before you heard anything. This was the opposite. It was sound first, then vibration, then a second wave of sound that was heavier than the first. Rotors. Military rotors, specifically. She knew the cadence. She'd heard it so many times on so many landing zones that the sound was cellular at this point, bypassing conscious recognition and going straight to something more primitive. Her body knew what that sound meant before her brain finished the sentence. She turned and looked out the hallway window. 2 helicopters. Black, no civilian markings, descending toward the hospital's helipad with a precision that spoke of crews who'd done this in conditions considerably more hostile than a Montana morning. A third appeared from behind the tree line, not landing, holding position, watching. And then they were down, and the doors were opening. The first soldier out was wearing tactical gear that Emily recognized not from any public catalog, but from proximity. She knew what that equipment meant. She knew which units used it, and she knew what kind of missions warranted it, and she knew that none of those missions were the kind that got filed under routine. They were moving fast. They came through the staff entrance to the ER. Not the public doors, the staff entrance, which meant someone had given them access codes or they had brought their own. And they filled the hallway in a way that rearranged the physics of the space. Nurses stepped back. An orderly with a medication cart pressed himself against the wall. A resident came out of a room, saw what was in the hallway, and went immediately back into the room. The man leading the unit was a colonel. She could tell from insignia, from bearing, from the particular way authority sat on some people's shoulders. He was scanning the hallway with the focused efficiency of a man doing a grid search, and his eyes moved past Emily once and then returned. He stopped. "Are you Brooks?" he said. "Emily Brooks?" She hadn't said a word. She hadn't moved. She looked at him and said, "Yes." Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly. More like a particular kind of exhale that people had after finding the thing they'd driven a long way to find. He turned to the soldier beside him and said something she couldn't hear, and then he looked back at her. "We need to talk," he said. "Right now." But son, inside the conference room that Garrett unlocked with hands that were noticeably unsteady, Colonel Warren Doss of the United States Army Special Operations Command laid a tablet on the table and slid it toward Emily without preamble. "The man in Trauma Bay 2, he said. "We believe you may have treated him previously." "I did," she said. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man crossing something off a list. "Tell me what you assessed before they removed you from the room." She told him. She used the terminology without softening it, because he would know what the terminology meant, and they didn't have time for softening. Hemothorax, splenic involvement, compromised perfusion pressure, the specific bruising distribution that indicated the impact had driven fractured rib segments inward rather than outward. She told him what she expected to see on imaging if they got him to imaging in time. She told him what would happen to the blood pressure if the internal bleeding wasn't addressed in the next... She checked her watch. "We have about 7 minutes before his pressure goes critical," she said. Colonel Doss looked at the soldier by the door. Get Dr. Hale out here. The soldier left. Emily and Doss sat across from each other for a moment. Why did they pull you out of the room? Doss asked. The chief of trauma doesn't take clinical input from travel nurses. He was wrong. Yes. You didn't fight it. Not my battle to fight that way, she said. I don't have any standing in this hospital. I handed over my badge and I stepped out and I was trying to figure out who to call when you landed. Doss studied her for a moment. Your service record, he started. I'm aware of my service record. 6 years active, 3 deployments. Army Achievement Medal, Army Commendation Medal, Combat Medical Badge, he paused. And 1 classified citation we can't discuss in general company. No, she agreed. We can't. The man on that gurney is a classified asset. His identity, his mission, the circumstances of his injury, none of that leaves this room without authorization from a level of command that is not currently in this building. I understand. What I need from you right now, Doss said, is to go back into that trauma bay and keep him alive. The door opened. Dr. Marcus Hale came in, and from the expression on his face, it was clear that his morning had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. He was still carrying the controlled composure of a chief of surgery, the practiced calm of a man who'd spent 2 decades in charge of rooms. But there was something new underneath it, something uncertain, which she suspected was not a familiar state for him. He looked at Emily, then at Doss, then at Emily again. Colonel, he said carefully, I understand the patient in Trauma Bay 2 is under federal protection, Doss said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His treatment is now a matter of national security. I've just been informed that your team has been running a standard chest wall protocol for the past 12 minutes. Hale stiffened. We are following appropriate. His pressure has dropped 14 points in the last 8 minutes, Doss said. Your team has not yet identified the source of internal bleeding. He looked at Emily. Sergeant Brooks identified it in under 2 minutes of observation. The silence in the room had texture. Hale looked at Emily. She's not... He stopped himself, started again. She doesn't have surgical privileges at this... I'm not asking about her privileges, Doss said. I'm telling you what's happening. Bring Sergeant Brooks in. Now. Hale's jaw moved. Several things crossed his face in quick succession. Disbelief, outrage, the particular humiliation of a man who is being told he was wrong in front of the person he dismissed. He swallowed all of it, not gracefully, but practically. There was a room full of soldiers in his hospital. The man on the gurney was apparently something considerably more than a routine trauma case. She doesn't have her badge, he said. It was the last available deflection, and they both knew it. Doss reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table. It was Emily's badge. She didn't know how he had it. She didn't ask. She does now, Doss said. Emily picked up her badge. She stood. Hale didn't look at her on the way out of the conference room. She didn't require him to. In the hallway, a soldier fell into step beside her. Not as escort, she understood. More like the battlefield habit of staying close to the person who was doing the most important thing. How's he doing? She asked. The soldier checked a comm unit on his wrist. His face didn't give much. Holding, he said. Barely. Emily walked faster. The doors of Trauma Bay 2 opened in front of her, and every face in the room turned. Sandra, the resident, the 2 nurses, the attending who had taken over from wherever he'd been when this started. They all looked at her. They'd watched her walk out 30 minutes ago with a security escort. They were watching her walk back in with a U.S. Army colonel behind her and 2 armed soldiers at the door. She moved to the gurney. She looked at the monitors, yet blood pressure 84/52 and dropping. She looked at the current IV setup, at the drainage situation, at the imaging they'd finally pulled up on the room's display. She looked at the man on the table. He was worse than 40 minutes ago. He was still alive. Okay, she said. Not to the room, not to any single person, just as a statement of where they were starting from. She pulled on gloves. Here's what we're going to do. Behind her, she heard Marcus Hale step through the doorway. She heard him stop. She didn't turn around. There was no time for that, and there was nothing in that direction she needed. The patient's pressure dropped again, and Emily Brooks was already moving. The chest tube went in on the first attempt, which was not luck. It was the product of having done this in conditions where a second attempt wasn't always an option. Emily worked with the focused economy of someone who had stripped away everything non-essential about the task. She wasn't performing for the room, she wasn't narrating her decisions or explaining her reasoning to the attending or making eye contact with the resident who kept hovering half a step too close to the supply cart. She just worked. Her hands moved with the kind of certainty that isn't confidence. Confidence can be faked, but is something closer to muscle memory that has been tested so many times under pressure that the pressure itself has become unremarkable. "I need suction on the left field," she said, "and get me a second large-bore IV, antecubital, right arm. The left line's going to slow when his pressure drops again." Sandra moved without comment. The attending, a doctor. Yoon positioned himself across the table and began following Emily's lead in the particular way that experienced clinicians sometimes did when they recognized they were in the presence of someone operating at a register they hadn't encountered before. Not deferring entirely, but calibrating, watching, filling in the gaps she left rather than cutting across her. It was the resident who was the problem. He asked a question at the wrong moment, something about imaging confirmation, and Emily said, "Not now," in a tone that wasn't unkind but was absolute, and he stepped back and didn't ask again. The blood pressure read 79/48. "He's going to arrest if we don't get ahead of this bleeding," she said. Not an alarm, a fact that needed to be on the table. "The chest tube is draining, but the volume tells me there's a second source. Splenic laceration, probably grade 3 based on the impact location. He needs a surgical suite." "I can have OR2 prepped in 12 minutes, Dr. Yoon said. "He doesn't have 12 minutes. She looked at the drainage output, looked at the monitor. "He has 6. Maybe 7 if we push fluids hard right now." Yoon looked across her to where Marcus Hale was standing near the door. There was a question in that look that nobody said out loud. The surgical suite decision required attending authorization. The attending authorization required the chief of trauma to sign off on an emergency escalation that was, technically, outside the standard protocol because they hadn't completed the full imaging sequence. The protocol existed for good reasons. Emily knew this. The protocol had also been designed for patients whose situation allowed for the protocol's timeline, which this one didn't. Hale said nothing for 3 seconds. In the context of what was happening on that table, 3 seconds was geological. "Clear or 2, he said. "See it." They moved the patient at a run. Emily had one hand on the gurney rail and her eyes on the portable monitor the entire length of the hallway, and she was calculating continuously. Fluid input versus blood loss, the trajectory of the pressure readings, the way his respiratory pattern had shifted in the last 90 seconds in a manner she didn't love. Colonel Doss kept pace beside her with his hands free and his face unreadable, which was its own kind of communication. "You've done this before," he said. Not a question. "More times than I'd like to count." With him specifically. "Once," she said, "different circumstances." "He made it." "Yes." "And now?" She glanced at the monitor. "Ask me in 40 minutes. The OR was not fully prepped. They had 7 minutes, not 12. And the difference was visible in the controlled scramble of the scrub team getting instruments laid out, while the anesthesiologist was still running his setup check. Emily scrubbed fast, gowned, and was at the table before Hale had finished his own prep. She was aware of him to her left. She was aware of the 2 soldiers who had positioned themselves just outside the OR door's window. She could see their silhouettes through the glass. She was aware of the scrub tech who kept glancing between her and Hale with an expression of thorough confusion about the chain of command in this room. She stopped being aware of any of it when she made the first incision. The splenic laceration was where she'd expected it. Grade 3, as she'd estimated, which meant it was manageable if they were fast and if the bleeding didn't cascade while they were working. She controlled the field with compression while Hale placed the primary sutures. She'd needed him for that. His hands were steady, whatever else she thought about him. And she managed the secondary bleed that opened up 11 minutes in with a technique she'd learned from a forward surgical team in a situation she was not going to describe in an OR in Montana. It worked. At 37 minutes, the patient's pressure began to climb. Not dramatically, not a movie moment with a flat line suddenly punching back into rhythm. It was quiet and incremental. 82, then 86, then 91 over 60. And the anesthesiologist made a small sound of relief that he probably didn't intend to be audible. The scrub tech exhaled. Dr. Yoon, watching from the observation position, put both hands on the railing in front of him. Emily kept working. She didn't celebrate pressure readings mid-surgery. She'd learned that the hard way. "Bleeding's controlled," Hale said. He said it to the room. He didn't say it to her specifically, which was fine. The information was accurate, and that was what mattered. "I want to look at the diaphragm before we close," she said. "The impact trajectory suggests there could be a microtear we haven't addressed." Hale paused, just briefly. Imaging didn't indicate. Imaging was running behind the clinical presentation by about 20 minutes, she said. "I'd like to look." Another pause. "Look," he said. She looked. There was a small tear in the inferior diaphragm, less than a centimeter, that would have been asymptomatic for days and then catastrophic. She closed it in 4 sutures. It took 6 minutes. When they finally closed, the patient was stable. Not out of danger. He wouldn't be out of danger for another 48 hours. And even then, the word danger was relative for a man in his situation. But stable in the clinical sense that mattered right now. His pressure was holding. He was breathing. His blood was staying where it belonged. Emily stepped back from the table. She stripped her outer gloves and dropped them in the bin by the door. She was aware that her hands were not entirely steady, which she noted with the detached interest of someone cataloging information about themselves. Adrenaline half-life. She'd eaten nothing since 4:30 in the morning. Colonel Doss was waiting in the scrub corridor. He looked at her face and apparently found what he was looking for. "He's stable," she said. Doss closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. "Good. He's going to need monitoring through the night. The diaphragm repair is going to be the wild card. I want someone watching his respiratory function every 30 minutes. I'll have my medical officer coordinate with your ICU." "He's not my ICU," she said. "I don't have a badge here, remember?" Doss looked at her steadily. "You do now. I made some calls while you were in surgery." He reached into his jacket, same pocket as before, and produced her Redwood Valley badge alongside a second card she didn't immediately recognize. She took both. The second card had a federal seal she wasn't going to examine too closely in a corridor with overhead fluorescence. "What's this?" "Temporary clinical authorization. It means nobody in this hospital can ask you to leave a room you need to be in." He paused. "For the next 72 hours. She looked at the card. She looked at him. "You had this made in the last 40 minutes? "We had it made before we landed," he said. She let that sit for a moment. "You knew I was here," she said. "We knew where you were when we were 40 minutes out. We knew your employment record, your placement history, and your clinical status at this facility." He said it without apology, which she appreciated. It would have been worse with apology. "Emily, we didn't come to Stonehaven because the nearest hospital happened to be here. We came because you were here and he needed you specifically." The corridor was quiet except for the distant sounds of the hospital reasserting its ordinary rhythms. A call button, a cart being wheeled, someone's clogs on linoleum. "You knew he'd be injured," she said. "We knew the operation carried a high probability of... You knew he'd be injured, and you had a contingency that included me." Doss didn't answer right away, and his silence was its own answer. She let it go. There were things you pressed on and things you didn't, and she'd spent enough time adjacent to classified operations to know which category this was. What mattered right now was that the man was alive and there was a 72-hour window in front of her and she needed to eat something before she fell over. "There's going to be an inquiry," Doss said, "into the treatment delay, into the circumstances of your removal from the trauma bay. That's not my concern." "It may become your concern. You're likely to be asked to give a statement." "I'll give an accurate one," she said. "That's all I can do." He nodded. "That's all I'm asking." Well, what happened next in the hospital was not something Emily witnessed in real time because she was in the ICU watching a man breathe. But she heard about it in pieces, from Sandra, who came to find her at 9:15 in a state of barely suppressed agitation, from a night shift orderly who had been positioned near the administrative wing and reported what he'd seen with the wide-eyed energy of someone who understood they'd been present at something historical, and eventually from Colonel Doss himself, who summarized it with the economy of a man filing a report. 2 military investigators had arrived in the second helicopter. She hadn't known that. She'd been focused on the patient. They had spent the 40 minutes of the surgery going through the trauma bay records, the intake documentation, the timeline of treatment decisions. They had pulled the security footage. They had interviewed Sandra, the paramedics, the attending, and Garrett, the security officer, who had apparently spent his interview looking like he wished he'd chosen a different profession. By the time Emily came out of the OR, the investigators had a preliminary picture. By the time the patient was settled in the ICU, they had a complete one. The intake delay was 9 minutes from arrival to first physician assessment, Doss told her at 11 o'clock, in the small family waiting area outside the ICU that they'd commandeered as a temporary command post. Standard is 3 minutes for a trauma presentation with the vital signs this patient presented. That's not unusual in a busy ER, Emily said. She wasn't defending anyone. She was being accurate. It's not the delay that's the problem. It's what happened during the delay. He slid a tablet toward her. Not the same one as before, a different one with a different display. The initial vital signs were flagged in the system at intake. There's a protocol at this facility for patients presenting with specific trauma indicators. Blood pressure below 90 on arrival, specific bruising distributions, field dressing indicating pre-hospital intervention on a penetrating or blunt force wound. It's a fast-track protocol. It bypasses the standard triage queue. It was never activated, Emily said. She didn't need to see the tablet. No, it wasn't activated, and the intake documentation shows it was reviewed and, this is the part that becomes a problem, manually overridden. She looked at him. By who? The override requires an attending signature. He paused. It was signed by Dr. Hale. Emily sat back in the plastic waiting room chair. It was an uncomfortable chair. She'd been sitting in worse for most of her adult life, which didn't make this one more comfortable, but gave her a reference point. Why would he override a fast-track protocol on a critical trauma patient, she said. That's one of the questions currently being put to Dr. Hale. And his answer? His current answer is that the patient's presentation didn't meet the threshold for the protocol in his clinical judgment. Doss picked up the tablet, looked at something on it, set it back down. The problem with that answer is that his own ER's intake data, logged before he ever entered the room, shows vital signs that are unambiguous. There's no clinical judgment interpretation that gets you from those numbers to does not meet threshold. Emily was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the 9 minutes. She was thinking about the protocol that existed for exactly this kind of case and hadn't been used. She was thinking about a man whose blood pressure she'd watched drop in real time while decisions were being made based on what? Hierarchy? Habit? Something else? He didn't know who the patient was, she said. He couldn't have. No, Doss agreed. He didn't know. So whatever drove his decision, it wasn't that. No. She didn't say anything else about it. She had an idea about what had driven the decision. A chief of trauma who'd built his reputation on a specific kind of control, in a hospital where he'd been the highest authority for 6 years, overriding a protocol because overriding a protocol was within his authority, and because the patient had come in without identification and without the kind of presentation that carried social weight. An unconscious man in field-cut clothes with no ID and a paramedic report that was sparse on detail was not the kind of patient that activated Hale's best professional instincts. She thought that was true. She also thought it was not her job to be right about a man's psychology tonight. Her job tonight was to make sure the man in the ICU kept breathing. She stood up. Her back ached from the OR table. She hadn't eaten anything since the coffee at 4:30. She thought about the vending machine she'd passed 3 hallways back and whether the machine had anything that wasn't orange crackers. There's one more thing, Doss said. She stopped. The investigators spoke with the paramedics who brought him in. He looked at her carefully. The patient made contact during transport. Brief, semi-conscious. He wasn't fully coherent, but he was verbal. What did he say? He gave them a name. He said it twice, and one of the paramedics wrote it down because she thought it might be relevant for next of kin. He looked at the tablet one more time. The name he gave was yours. Emily stood in the doorway of the family waiting room and let that settle somewhere in her chest where she didn't have the vocabulary to name it. He knew I was here, she said. It appears so. She thought about that. She thought about a classified operation and a contingency plan, and a colonel who'd arrived with her name already on a list. She thought about what it meant that a man in semi-conscious shock, on the worst day he'd had in recent memory, had surfaced from whatever darkness he was in and reached for one specific name. She thought, he trusted you to be there, and she almost hadn't been. She walked back toward the ICU without saying anything else, because there wasn't anything else to say yet. In the hallway, she passed Marcus Hale, going in the opposite direction. He was accompanied by one of the military investigators, a woman in civilian clothes who had the posture of someone who'd spent significant time in uniform, and he was carrying a folder of documents, and his face had the particular quality of a man who had recently realized that the story he'd been telling himself about the morning did not match the story other people had recorded. He saw Emily. She saw him. Neither of them stopped walking. She pushed through the ICU door and took the chair beside the patient's bed and looked at the monitors, which were reading stable, and at the man's face, which was battered and still, and she thought about the name he'd said in the back of an ambulance when he didn't know where he was or whether he was going to make it. Her name, out of everything his mind could have surfaced. She stayed in that chair for 2 hours. She drank a terrible cup of vending machine coffee at midnight. She watched the monitors and she watched him breathe, and she kept thinking about what Doss had said. We came because you were here. And about the 9-minute delay, and about the protocol override with Hale's signature on it, and about all the decisions that had been made in this building today before anyone understood what kind of morning they were actually inside. At 2:17 in the morning, the patient's right hand moved. It was small, a slight curl of the fingers, not coordinated, the kind of movement that happens in deep sedation and doesn't necessarily mean anything. Emily leaned forward anyway. His eyes didn't open, his vitals didn't change. His fingers moved once more and then were still. But then his lips moved. Just barely. She leaned closer to hear it, and what she heard was not her name, and it was not coherent language, and it was not anything she could have written down and shown to Colonel Doss as evidence of anything. What she heard was a sound that resolved, after a moment, into what might have been a word. She sat back in the chair. Her heart was beating at a pace she had not authorized. Because if she'd heard what she thought she'd heard, and she might be wrong, she was exhausted. She'd been awake since 4:30. The ICU had the specific time-distorting quality of all I see us. Then the man in the bed was not simply semi-conscious. He was trying to warn her about something. She sat very still for a moment, listening to the ICU's ambient sounds. The rhythmic compression of the ventilator in the next bay, a nurse's footsteps 2 rooms over, the soft alarm of a pulse oximeter being adjusted somewhere down the hall, and tried to reconstruct exactly what she'd heard. The word, if it was a word, had sounded like 12, or possibly leave. Or it had been neither, and her brain, running on 4 hours of sleep and 1 cup of vending machine coffee that had tasted like hot sadness, had assembled a pattern from noise the way exhausted brains did. She leaned forward again. His face was still. His respiration was steady, following the vent's rhythm without fighting it, which was a good sign. His blood pressure was holding at 96/62, which was not ideal but was sustainable and trending better than it had been 3 hours ago. Nothing on any monitor suggested he was closer to consciousness than deep sedation. She sat back. 12. She turned the sound over in her mind. In the field, they had used numerical codes for things that couldn't be said plainly over open channels. 12 had meant different things in different operational contexts. She hadn't served in a unit that used a fixed codebook. The work was too compartmentalized for that. But there had been one use, specific to the kind of work she'd been adjacent to on her second deployment, where 12 had meant something clear and urgent. It had meant there are others. She stood up. She walked to the ICU station and found the night nurse, a man named Brendan, young, who had been monitoring her patient alongside 2 others and who looked up when she approached with the slightly wary expression of someone who'd been watching a woman sit motionless beside a sedated patient for 2 hours at 3 in the morning. Has anyone from the military detail been in contact with the floor in the last hour? She asked. Colonel Doss checked in around 1, Brendan said. He's in the administrative suite down on 2. They set up a room. I need you to call him, she said. Right now. It's 3 in the... I'm aware of what time it is. Call him. She was back at the bedside when Doss appeared 11 minutes later, which told her he'd either been awake or was a man who moved fast from a dead sleep. Given everything she knew about him so far, she suspected the former. He came in without the jacket. His shirt was untucked on one side. He looked at her and then at the patient and then back at her. What happened? He made a sound, she said. I think it was a word. I think it was 12. Doss went very still. Tell me exactly what you heard, he said. His voice had changed register. Not louder, not harder, but more focused, the way a signal got cleaner when you cut the interference. She told him. Exactly what she'd heard, exactly the duration of the sound, exactly her degree of confidence, which she placed at somewhere between 50 and 60%, which was an honest number, and she wasn't going to inflate it to be more useful than she actually was. When she finished, Doss stepped out of the ICU. She could see him through the glass panel in the door, standing in the corridor with a phone pressed to his ear, not moving. He stayed on the call for 4 minutes. When he came back, his face had the compressed quality of someone who had just received information that was reorganizing everything else. We need to talk, he said. Not here. Shut. The administrative suite on the second floor had been transformed in the 8 hours since the helicopters had landed. There were 2 laptops open on the conference table, a scrambled communications terminal that she recognized from its housing as military grade, and 3 people she hadn't seen before. 2 of them in civilian clothes, with the build and stillness of people who operated in environments where stillness was a professional requirement, and 1 in a uniform with intelligence branch insignia who looked up when Emily walked in and immediately looked at Doss with a question on his face. She's cleared for this, Doss said. The intelligence officer, a major named Hart, who had the lean, angular face of someone who'd spent years in dry climates, pulled up a map on one of the laptops and turned it toward the table. The asset's insertion was part of a larger operation, Doss said to Emily, without preamble. We brought him in alone because the circumstances required a solo exit. What we didn't know when we extracted him, what we've been piecing together in the last 6 hours, is whether the rest of the team made it out. Emily looked at the map. She wasn't going to ask where it was. She wasn't going to ask what the operation had been. She knew those weren't questions she'd get answers to, and she didn't need them for what she was actually here for. 12, she said. You think he was telling me there were 12 people? The team size was 11, Hart said, plus the asset, 12 total. The room was quiet for a moment. So he's saying the team is still out there, Emily said. That's the working interpretation, Doss said. If he's sufficiently conscious to form words, he may also be close enough to the surface to communicate, which changes what we need from his treatment trajectory significantly. You want to reduce sedation, she said. Can it be done safely? She thought about the diaphragm repair, the splenic laceration, the chest tube that was still draining minimal residual fluid. She thought about his blood pressure, which had been stable for 3 hours. She thought about the specific risks of lightning sedation in a post-surgical patient with thoracic involvement, pain response causing respiratory compromise, agitation pulling at sutures, blood pressure spiking against fresh repairs. Not without risk, she said, and not quickly. You're talking about a careful titration, probably over the next 4 to 6 hours, with someone monitoring his respiratory response continuously. Could you do it? I'm a nurse, not an anesthesiologist. The anesthesiologist on call tonight is Dr. Pellman, Hart said. We've already cleared him. Then it needs to be Pellman making the decisions on the sedation protocol. I can be there. I can give him the clinical context Pellman won't have. She paused. But I want it on the record that I'm advising caution. If this man's pressure destabilizes when we reduce sedation, we could lose the repair. Noted, Doss said. And understood. I need you to give me your honest assessment of the risk percentage. 30% chance of a complication we'll have to manage, maybe 15% chance of a complication we can't. She said it steadily. It was the honest number. She wasn't going to round it in either direction to make the decision easier or harder for him. He didn't flinch at it. She hadn't expected him to. Start the process, he said. Dr. Pellman, when woken and briefed, had the admirable quality of becoming fully functional within approximately 90 seconds of being told what was needed. He was 55, unhurried by disposition, and he reviewed the patient's surgical notes and current sedation levels with the thorough attention of someone who understood that the notes he was reading were the only orientation he was going to get. "This diaphragm repair," he said, looking at Emily across the patient's bed at 4 a.m. 4 sutures, inferior margin, small tear, clean closure. How confident are you in the integrity? Confident enough to do the titration, not confident enough to rush it. He nodded. Then we won't rush it. He adjusted the propofol infusion downward by a margin that was conservative by most standards. We move in increments. Any sign of respiratory distress, we reverse. Agreed. They worked through the early morning in a productive silence, with Brendan monitoring the vitals readouts and Doss sitting in a chair against the wall that he'd brought in himself without asking anyone. His presence unobtrusive in the way of people who'd learned how to be in rooms where they weren't the most important person without making that into a thing. The patient's response to the reduced sedation was slow. His blood pressure ticked upward slightly at the first adjustment. Not alarmingly, but enough that Emily put a hand on Pellman's arm, and they waited 15 minutes before the next increment. His respiratory pattern shifted from the vent-following regularity of deep sedation into something more irregular, more his own, which was what they wanted and also what they were watching most carefully. At 5:40 in the morning, his eyes moved under his lids. At 6:03, they opened, not widely, not with clarity. He looked at the ceiling of the ICU with the specific unfocused quality of a man whose brain was receiving signals before it had reconstructed the framework for interpreting them. Emily leaned into his field of vision. She kept her voice low and level, the way you talk to someone coming back from a long way away. "You're in a hospital," she said. "You're stable. You had surgery. You're going to be okay." His eyes moved. They found her face. Something happened in them. Not recognition, not yet, but the beginning of it. "Don't try to talk," she said. "Nod if you can hear me." A pause. Then, slowly, he nodded. Behind her, she heard Doss get up from his chair. She held up a hand without turning around. "Give him a minute." She didn't know if Doss would respect that. He did. "You said something earlier," she said to the patient, "when you were under. I think you were trying to tell me something." She watched his face. "I think I heard you." 12. His jaw tightened. His eyes sharpened, the unfocused quality pulling back as something urgent pushed through the sedation fog. His lips moved. "The team," he said. The words were rough, barely above a whisper, broken up by the work of speaking through a throat that had been intubated for hours. "Still, out there." "We know," she said. "Colonel Doss is working on it." He tried to move. It was reflexive, the body's instinct to act on the information the mind was generating, and it was also genuinely dangerous for a man with a 4-suture diaphragm repair. Emily put both hands on his shoulders with enough pressure to be clear without being harsh. "Stop," she said. "You cannot move right now. Your body is not ready. What you need to do is lie still and tell us what you know, and let other people handle the rest." He stopped. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man translating between the world he'd just come from and the one he was currently in. "Brooks," he said. "Yes." "You look terrible." She almost laughed. She didn't. "You're one to talk," she said. Doss moved to the bedside. Emily stepped aside enough to give him space but stayed within the patient's eye line because she could see that her presence was functioning as an anchor, and she wasn't going to remove it yet. The conversation that followed was short, fragmented, and she understood only portions of it. They moved into language that was partly code, partly shorthand for a shared operational context she didn't have. But she understood enough. She understood that there were 11 people in a location that the asset was trying to communicate with a clarity his current state wouldn't quite allow, and she understood that the window for reaching them was measured in hours rather than days. And she understood that the look on Doss's face as he listened was the look of a man revising calculations that had significant consequences. When the patient's blood pressure spiked, not dramatically, but enough, She moved Doss back and got Pellman, and they managed it, and when things stabilized again, the patient was drifting back down toward lighter sleep rather than full consciousness, his body making the executive decision that it had given what it could for now. Doss stepped out. Emily stayed until she was sure the sleep was genuine rest and not distress. In the corridor, Doss was on his phone again. She leaned against the wall and waited. Her back ached from the surgical positioning. Her eyes felt like they'd been dipped in sand. She thought about the photograph in her wallet, her squad, their faces arranged in the unself-conscious way of people who don't know they're being photographed, and she felt the weight of what had just happened in that ICU room in a way she didn't have a clean shape for. By 7 in the morning, the day shift had arrived, and the hospital had begun reassembling into something that looked from a distance like a normal Thursday. Nurses changed over. The morning meal service started. The administrative offices filled up with the ordinary business of a regional medical center. Scheduling, billing, supply management, the thousand small frictions of an institution trying to run itself. The military investigators were still there. They were less visible now than they'd been. They'd traded the hallway positions for conference rooms and private conversations. But their presence hadn't diminished. It had just changed texture. Emily was in the break room, eating a breakfast sandwich from the cafeteria that she was fairly sure she'd needed 6 hours ago when Sandra came in and sat down across from her with the expression of someone carrying news they weren't sure was welcome. "Hale is in a meeting with administration and the investigators," Sandra said. "Has been since 6. Emily chewed. "Okay." "Emily," Sandra's voice had a particular weight to it. "I heard what they found. The protocol override, the intake documentation." "I don't know what you've been told." "I know what I saw on that gurney," Sandra said. "I know you tried to tell me. I know I—" She stopped, restarted. "I should have listened." Emily looked at her. Sandra had been a nurse for 19 years. She was good at her job. She had also spent 6 of those years in a system where Marcus Hale was the authority, and any clinical instinct that contradicted him had a high social cost. "You were doing your job," Emily said, "in the system you work in." "That's not an excuse." "No," Emily agreed, "but it's a reason. They're different things." Sandra looked at her hands. "Is he going to make it? The patient?" "He woke up this morning," Emily said. "He talked." Sandra absorbed that. "Because of what you did." "Because of what Pellman did, and Yoon, and Hale's suture work in the OR, and the paramedics who got him here fast enough that there was still something to save." She finished the sandwich. "It's not usually one person." "You know that's not—" "Sandra." She said it gently but firmly. "I'm very tired and I have to go back upstairs." She almost missed it. She was in the elevator going back to the ICU when she checked her phone out of habit. She'd had it on silent since entering the OR 12 hours ago, and saw a text from a number she didn't recognize that had come in at 6:47 a.m. It was 6 words long. What did he say to them? Not a question. No punctuation. Sent from a number that, when she looked at it, had no area code she recognized, and a prefix that her brain filed as not right before she could articulate why. She stood in the elevator and stared at it. The doors opened on the 3rd floor. She didn't move. They closed again. The elevator went down. She wasn't going to tell herself she was certain about what she was looking at because she wasn't certain. She was tired and possibly wrong, but she was also a woman who had spent years in environments where messages like this one had specific meanings, and her instincts in those environments had been accurate enough that people had trusted them with their lives, including the man currently in an ICU bed on the 3rd floor. She forwarded the text to Doss with a message that said only, "Look at this immediately." Then she got off the elevator on the 2nd floor and walked fast to the administrative suite. Doss was there. He'd assembled more people. The room was crowded now. The laptops multiplied. Someone had brought in a whiteboard. He saw her face when she came through the door and met her halfway across the room. She showed him the phone. She watched him read it. She watched his expression do something she hadn't seen it do before. It went through about 4 things in rapid succession, none of which resolved into anything she could cleanly name. "Who has your number?" he said. "Nobody in this building. My agency, my supervisor back in Helena, my landlord." She paused. "People I served with." "Which people?" Various. She was honest about the limits of that. I didn't keep in close contact. It's not a short list. He handed the phone to Hart without taking his eyes off Emily. Run it. Hart plugged the phone into something on the table. Emily watched the activity in the room, which had changed pitch again. Something had shifted in the last 30 seconds, the same way a pressure system changed before a storm arrived. Someone knew you were here before we landed, Doss said. You knew I was here before you landed, she said. Yes, and whoever sent this text... He stopped. Might have known the same way, she said, or they might have a different source. The implication expanded between them. She'd come into this morning as the person Hale had thrown out of a trauma bay. She'd spent the last 10 hours becoming, incrementally, the most operationally significant civilian in the building. And now someone she couldn't identify, from a number that Hart was currently running and whose face as he worked was telling her something she couldn't yet read, had sent her a message asking what the patient had said. The only people who knew the patient had regained consciousness were the ICU night nurse, Dr. Pellman, Doss, and Emily herself, and whoever was asking. Hart looked up from the terminal. He said one sentence to Doss in a voice low enough that Emily caught only the shape of it and not the words. But she caught enough. She caught the word internal, and she caught the number Hart referenced, and she felt the room reorganize itself around a new center of gravity. Doss looked at her with the expression of a man who had just added a new problem to a stack of problems that was already significant. I need you to go back to the ICU, he said. Don't leave that room. Don't let anyone in who isn't Brendan or Pellman. Anyone else, anyone at all. You call me before you open the door. What's happening? The text didn't come from outside, he said. She held very still. It came from inside this building, he said, from a device that is currently somewhere in Redwood Valley Medical Center. And in the ICU 3 floors above them, the patient who had fought his way back to consciousness just long enough to say the team is still out there was lying alone with one nurse and a monitor that would tell you when something went wrong, but not always fast enough to stop it. And Emily was already moving toward the elevator before Doss finished his sentence. She took the stairs. The elevator was faster, but the stairwell gave her a sight line that the elevator didn't, and right now sight lines mattered. She moved up 3 flights without rushing, fast enough to cover ground, controlled enough to arrive thinking rather than winded, and pushed through the door to the 3rd floor with her hand already reaching for her phone. Brendan was at the ICU station. He looked up when she came through. Normal. No tension in his posture, no indication that anything had changed in the 7 minutes since she'd left. Anyone come in? She said. Dr. Pellman checked in about 5 minutes ago. Left again. Why? Nobody else? No. He paused. Should I be concerned? Stay at the station, she said. Don't buzz anyone in without calling me first. Anyone. She went into the room. The patient was where she'd left him. In bed, monitors tracking, the quiet regularity of a man in post-surgical sleep. She stood at the foot of the bed and did a systematic check. Monitors, IV lines, the chest tube output bag, the dressing on his abdomen. Everything was where it should be. Nothing had been touched. She positioned herself in the chair closest to the door and took 3 slow breaths. The text had come from inside this building. Doss had said it clearly, and she had no reason to disbelieve him. Someone in Redwood Valley Medical Center had a device that had sent a message to her personal phone asking what the patient had said during his brief window of consciousness, a window that had been known to, at most, 4 people, and one of those people was currently sedated. She worked backward through the morning, who had been in or near the ICU between 6 a.m. and 6:47 a.m. Brendan, continuously. Dr. Pellman, twice. Doss. The 2 civilian-clothed members of Doss's team who had traded off corridor duty. A cleaning staff member whose name she didn't know who had come in to empty the waste bins around 5:30 and left. The night shift nurses from the adjacent ICU bays. She thought about Marcus Hale, who had been in a meeting with the investigators since 6. If he had a device planted or a message routed through someone else's phone, that was possible. It was also possible she was constructing a narrative because she was tired and her brain needed something to push on. Her phone buzzed. Doss. Stay in room. Heart is isolating the device. Do not engage anyone who comes to ICU. We are 10 minutes out from identification. She typed back. Understood. Then she put the phone face down on her thigh and watched the door. 8 minutes, by her count. The door opened. She was on her feet before she registered the decision to stand, which told her something about the state of her nervous system. It was a woman she'd seen in the hospital before but hadn't spoken to. Administrative staff, mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, wearing the kind of lanyard that said middle management rather than clinical. She was carrying a tablet, and she looked, on first glance, like someone doing a routine administrative check-in, which was exactly the kind of look that shouldn't exist at 7:30 in the morning in an ICU room containing a classified military asset. "Can I help you?" Emily said. The woman's eyes went to the patient, then back to Emily, with a practiced quality that almost looked natural. Almost. "I'm from Patient Services," she said. "Routine ID verification for our unidentified admission." "This patient is under federal protection," Emily said. "He's not in our unidentified system. Any administrative access to this room requires Colonel Doss's authorization." "I was told—" "I don't care what you were told." She moved slightly to her left, which put her between the woman and the bed. "Call Doss's office directly. Room 212. If this is a legitimate administrative visit, they'll confirm it in 2 minutes." The woman looked at her. There was a calculation happening behind her eyes that had nothing to do with Patient Services. "Of course," she said. "I'll confirm through the proper channel." She left. She didn't hurry, which was the thing Emily noted most. She left at a pace that was calibrated to look like someone who wasn't hurrying. Emily was on the phone to Doss before the door had fully closed. "A woman just tried to access the room," she said. "Administrative staff, claim Patient Services, doesn't match the profile. She's heading—" She looked through the door's glass panel. She went left toward the elevator bank. She heard noise on Doss's end. Movement, voices. "Description," he said. She gave it. 45 seconds later, she heard through the phone the words, "We have her," and then Doss's voice directed at someone else in a tone that was not a suggestion. Emily sat back down. Her hands, she noticed, were not shaking. She found this mildly surprising. She was running on 5 hours of fragmented rest. She'd spent the night at a surgical table and then at a hospital bedside. She just squared off with someone who may or may not have intended harm to a man she'd kept alive through significant effort, and her hands were steady. She thought about what that said about her and decided it was a subject for another time. The patient's monitor showed a blood pressure of 99/64, trending upward, slow and clean. "Good," she said to no one. Doss came to the ICU personally at 8:15. He didn't sit down. He stood near the window with his arms crossed and the compressed energy of a man reorganizing everything he knew around new information, and he told her what they'd found in the 40 minutes since she'd called. The woman's name was Verna Cast. She was, in fact, employed in Redwood Valley Medical Center's administrative department, patient financial services specifically, which explained the lanyard, and she had been working at the hospital for 3 years. She was also, as of 1 hour ago, the subject of a federal investigation that had been opened in a jurisdiction she was not going to be pleased about. The device used to send Emily the text had been a secondary phone registered to a prepaid carrier found in Cass's jacket pocket. The message had been sent to Emily's number from a contact list that contained 6 other numbers, none of which were registered to identifiable individuals, all of which were currently being traced. "She had your personal number," Emily said. "She had a list," Doss said. "Your number was on it. We don't know yet who compiled it or how it was sourced." "How long has she been in contact with whoever she's working with?" "The device shows 18 months of activity." He paused. "She wasn't recruited for this specific situation. She was already in place." Emily processed that. 3 years at the hospital, recruited at least 18 months ago, positioned inside a regional medical center in Stonehaven, Montana, which was not the kind of place anyone positioned assets unless they had a specific reason. "She knew he'd come here," Emily said, "or she knew there was a probability he'd come here given the geography of the operation. We're still working out the specifics." His jaw tightened slightly. "The 11 people on the team? We've made contact. They're secure." Different exit route than planned, complicated, but secure. Something released in Emily's chest that she hadn't known was locked. "He'll want to know that," she said, looking at the patient. "When he's ready to be told," Doss agreed. "What happens to Cast?" "That's above my authority to tell you." He met her eyes. "But I can tell you that federal charges at the level she's looking at are not something a 3-year hospital employment history is going to offset." She nodded. She didn't need more than that. "There's something else," Doss said. He moved to the chair she'd been sitting in and sat down, which was significant because in the hours she'd known him, he'd done that precisely twice. And both times it had preceded information that required a different kind of conversation. "The investigators finished their review at about 4 this morning," he said. "I've been waiting to brief you until we had the full picture." He put his hands on his knees. Marcus Hale didn't just override the fast-track protocol. Emily waited. "He falsified the documentation," Doss said. "The override notation in the intake record shows a clinical reasoning note, standard procedure. You're supposed to document why you're overriding a protocol flag. His note references specific vital sign values that do not match the actual readings recorded by the intake system. The intake system is automated and time-stamped. The override note was entered manually, 7 minutes after the automated recording." She went very still. "He changed the numbers," she said. "He documented a blood pressure and respiratory rate that, if accurate, would have supported a standard triage approach rather than a fast track. The actual numbers, the automated numbers, which are backed up in a system he does not have access to modify, tell a different story." The silence in the room had weight. "That's not an error in clinical judgment," she said. "No," Doss said. "It isn't." He knew what the real numbers were. He'd reviewed the intake data before he entered the notation. "The access logs confirm the sequence," Doss said. He opened the intake record. He saw the automated vitals, and then he entered a different set of vitals in the override note. Emily thought about the 9 minutes. She thought about standing at the gurney and seeing what she'd seen, and then being walked out of the room by Garrett, while Marcus Hale stood at the counter with the authority of a man who did not answer to travel nurses. She thought about the specific coldness of a falsified number in a medical record. Not a mistake, not a shortcut born of pressure or exhaustion, but a deliberate substitution of one set of facts for another. "Why?" she said. And then, because she could see Doss about to give her a deflective answer, "What's the theory?" "The investigator's current theory," he said carefully, "is that Hale has a pattern, not specific to this patient. They didn't know who this patient was. The pattern is about coverage, about how cases that don't go well at this hospital get documented after the fact." He paused. "There are 4 other cases in the past 18 months where the automated vitals and the physician override documentation don't align. In 3 of those cases, the patient had a significantly worse outcome than the initial presentation would have predicted. And the documentation made it look like the presentation didn't warrant faster intervention," Emily said. "In each case, yes." She sat with that for a moment. This was what it actually looked like when an institution's faith in one person's authority went unchecked for long enough. Not a villain who arrived knowing he'd cause harm. A man who had simply learned, over time, that when outcomes were bad, he could adjust the story, and the story would hold because he was the one who held the pen. "He's going to try to explain this away," she said. "He's been trying for the past 2 hours, Doss said. His attorney arrived at 6:45. "His attorney was here at 6:45 in the morning?" "He was called at 4. Something in Doss's expression. "Dr. Hale made a phone call at 3:58 a.m. before the investigators finished their review." 40 minutes before," Doss said, which means he knew, at 4 in the morning, that there was something in his documentation that he needed to be defended for. He let that sit for a moment. He wasn't told the documentation review was complete. The investigators hadn't notified him. He called his attorney based on his own read of the situation. Because he knew what was in the records, Emily said. He knew it wouldn't survive scrutiny. That would be the logical interpretation. She thought about Hale's face in the OR. The steady hands, the suture work that had genuinely been competent, the man who had received his training at good institutions and built a functional surgical career. She thought about how much easier it would be if he were simply bad at what he did, because bad at what you do was a more comprehensible failure than what this actually was. What happens now, she said. Now, Doss said, is where it gets visible. She didn't go back to the conference room for what happened next. She heard about it from Sandra, who witnessed portions of it, and from a second-year resident named Thomas Wick, who had the shell-shocked expression of someone who'd watched a building get demolished and was still working out that it had been the building he worked in. At 9 in the morning, a federal investigator named Agent Calloway, one of the civilian clothes pair from the second helicopter, whose actual title Emily now understood was considerably more significant than her appearance suggested, walked into the administrative conference room where Marcus Hale and his attorney were seated across from 2 hospital board members and the acting CMO, and delivered a summary of findings that took 11 minutes and did not require a raised voice at any point. The findings included the falsified intake documentation on the classified patient, the 4 additional cases with documentation discrepancies, a pattern of protocol override authorizations issued by Hale over a 22-month period that had been flagged internally by 2 nursing staff members whose complaints had been archived without review, and the formal removal of Dr. Marcus Hale from his position as Chief of Trauma Surgery at Redwood Valley Medical Center, effective immediately and pending criminal investigation by federal authorities. Sandra had been in the hallway outside, called in on a matter related to intake documentation. She described what she saw when the conference room door opened. Hale walking out with his attorney on one side and a federal investigator on the other. He was not in handcuffs. Not yet, Sandra said, though she didn't know what that meant for what came next. He was in the clothes he'd come in wearing, and he walked through the main administrative corridor in front of every nurse, every clerk, every administrator who happened to be moving through that space at 9:15 on a Thursday morning. Word moves fast in a hospital. Every person in that hallway knew who he was, and most of them knew, by that point, some version of what had happened. The corridor was not silent. Hospitals don't go silent. But the particular quality of sound changed as he walked through it. People didn't stop talking. They just talked about something else and watched. Tomas Wick had been at the nurses' station when Hale passed. He said Hale didn't look at anyone. He walked straight ahead with the deliberate forward focus of a man who had decided that looking at the people around him would cost him something he wasn't willing to spend. At the end of the corridor near the staff exit, he stopped. He turned around. Tomas said he looked back down the length of the hallway, at the nurses' station, at the administrative desks, at the faces that weren't quite looking at him directly. He stood there for about 5 seconds. Then he went through the door. He didn't come back. Emily heard all of this in pieces over the next 3 hours while she sat in the ICU. She didn't go to watch. She'd been asked twice, by Sandra, by a colleague she barely knew from the overnight shift who appeared to think she'd want to witness the moment. And she'd said no both times without elaborating. It wasn't mercy. She wasn't soft on what Hale had done. She'd looked at the documented evidence of 4 other patients whose clinical trajectories had been shaped by a chief of surgery protecting his record instead of their lives. And she'd felt something about that which was cold and clear, and not susceptible to being called anything as mild as disappointment. She just didn't need to see him walk out. The fact of it was enough. What she needed was to be in the room with the patient, who at 10:47 a.m. opened his eyes for the second time. This time there was more in them. The sedation was lower. His body had done 8 hours of restorative work, and when he looked at Emily, he stayed focused for longer than 30 seconds. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. "The team." He said it immediately, the operational priority surfacing before anything else. "Safe," she said. "All 12. Doss confirmed it." He closed his eyes. She watched his blood pressure steady. She watched his breathing slow into something that was relief rather than sedation. When he opened them again, he looked at her differently, not like a patient at a nurse, like someone who was remembering. "Kandahar," he said. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. A sound came out of him that was almost a laugh, which she found both encouraging from a respiratory standpoint and slightly alarming from a suture tension standpoint. "Right," he said, "you don't." "How are you feeling?" she said. "Like someone did surgery on me." "2 surgeries, technically. You had a rough morning yesterday." "What day is it?" "Thursday." He absorbed that. She could see him doing the math, working out the timeline. I was out for long enough that we were having conversations about whether to worry, she said. Short enough that it worked out. He was quiet for a moment. They had someone inside, he said. We know, she's in custody. Cast, he said. Emily went still. You knew her name. I knew a name, he said. Wasn't sure it connected to this location until you said she was in custody. He looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man adding and rechecking a column of figures. I couldn't get the communication out before I was compromised. There wasn't time. You got enough out, she said. I got one word out. He looked at her. How did you... I know what 12 means, she said, in the operational context. He looked at her for a moment. You always were better at that stuff than you let on. I was a medic, she said. I paid attention. You did more than that. He shifted slightly. She put a hand up and he stopped moving without being told, which indicated that whatever his pain levels were currently doing, the body memory of following a medic's instruction was deep. In Kandahar, what I said then, I don't know if anyone passed it along to you. Don't, she said. Emily. She hadn't heard her first name from him before. She hadn't known he knew it. What happened then is done, she said. What matters is that you're here, that the team is secure, that what needed to be accomplished got accomplished. He looked at her for a long moment. He had the face of someone who had been told many times to accept the version of an experience that fit inside the official record, and had done it, and was deciding whether to do it now. Okay, he said. Okay. She adjusted the IV line. She checked the drainage. She did the small procedural things that gave both of them a moment to be in the room without the weight of everything that had just been said. They're going to debrief me, he said. Probably. And then there are going to be a lot of official conversations about what happened in this hospital before I got here. Probably, she said again. You're going to be in those conversations. I've been told. He looked at her carefully. You okay with that? She thought about it honestly. I'll give an accurate account, she said. Same as I would give for anything. What happened is what happened. I was here, I saw what I saw, I did what I could do. That's the sum of it. That's more than the sum of it, he said. She let that stand without answering. She picked up his chart, her own running notes, not the official record, a habit from years of tracking patients through circumstances where the official record was sometimes hours behind the reality, and made a notation. Sleep, she said. You need more of it. Bossy, he said. I'm a nurse, she said. That's the job. He slept. At 1 in the afternoon, Agent Calloway came to find Emily in the ICU corridor. She was younger than she'd initially seemed, or maybe the morning light made it visible in a way the fluorescent corridor of the previous night hadn't. She had the efficient bearing of someone who'd moved through a lot of institutions without being captured by any of them, which Emily recognized because she suspected people sometimes said the same about her. We'd like a formal statement, Calloway said. When you're ready. Not urgently. We have what we need from the documentation and the investigators' observations. Your statement is for completeness. I can do it this afternoon, Emily said. There's no rush. I know. I'd rather do it while everything is still clear. Calloway studied her for a moment. You slept how many hours last night? 4, approximately. And you've been here since... I went home at 2. I came back at 4:30. She paused. That's typical. Is it? I was in the Army for 6 years, Emily said. 4 hours is a good night in certain contexts. Something moved through Calloway's expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the general neighborhood of one. We're going to need a lot from you in the next few days, she said. Hale's defense is going to challenge the clinical narrative. They're going to try to argue that the intake decision was a legitimate exercise of attending authority. His documentation says otherwise. His documentation is damning, Calloway agreed, but he's going to try to create a counter-narrative that positions your involvement as unauthorized, your clinical assessment as outside your scope. I was a combat medic for 6 years, Emily said. My scope is documented. It is, extensively. Calloway paused. That's actually the part of this that I suspect is going to be a problem for Dr. Hale's attorneys. What do you mean? When we pulled your service record, she stopped, revised. When we confirmed your service record with the relevant authorities, there were commendations in it that I'm not able to reference specifically, but I can tell you that the level of clinical expertise documented in your personnel file is not what most people expect when they hear emergency room travel nurse. She paused again. Dr. Hale dismissed you as a travel nurse. That dismissal is on camera in the trauma bay, witnessed by 5 medical staff members. And your documented qualifications are going to sit next to that footage in every proceeding this case generates. Emily said nothing for a moment. He judged the title, she said. Yes. Not the experience. No. Calloway's voice was even. Not the experience. They stood in the corridor for a moment in the afternoon light that came through the window at the end of the hall, the particular flat light of a Montana October that made everything look like it was in the middle of something, rather than at any fixed point. There's one more thing, Calloway said, and I want to give you some time to think about it before you respond, because it doesn't require an immediate answer. Emily waited. Colonel Doss has submitted a formal recommendation, Calloway said. It's going upward through a chain of command that I'm not in, so I can't tell you the specific designation, but it concerns you specifically and the role you played in the events of the last 24 hours. She paused. It's a significant recommendation. I was doing my job, Emily said. That's not mutually exclusive with what he submitted, Calloway said. Take some time. Think about it. She checked the tablet she'd been carrying. We'll schedule your statement for 4 o'clock if that works. It works, Emily said. Calloway left. Emily leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the ICU door. Through the narrow window, she could see the monitor displaying the patient's vitals, which were reading. She checked the numbers against her memory of what they'd been. Better. Incrementally, steadily, measurably better. She stayed there for a moment. The corridor was busy in the afternoon way of hospital corridors, people moving with purpose, carts being navigated, the ordinary friction of an institution doing its work. Nobody stopped to look at her. Nobody asked her anything. She was just a nurse in scrubs standing against a wall on the 3rd floor of a regional medical center in Montana, which was the most completely unremarkable thing in the world. She thought about what Calloway had said. A significant recommendation. She had a general sense of what that meant, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She thought about her squad photograph. She thought about what it meant that a man in semi-conscious shock had reached for her name before anything else. She thought about Marcus Hale walking out of the administrative corridor without looking at anyone, and about 4 other patients and the ways their stories had been written after the fact to protect a record rather than a life. She thought about Verna Cast and a prepaid phone and 18 months of being in place, and all the things that had been in motion before any helicopter landed, and the specific and accidental way that she had been standing in the right hallway at the right moment when the ambulance doors came open. She thought, I almost didn't say anything. She thought, but I did. She pushed off the wall and went back into the ICU. The patient was sleeping. His pressure was reading 104/68, the best number it had shown since he'd arrived, and his color was different than it had been the night before. The specific grayness of someone in crisis was gone, replaced by something that was still far from healthy but was undeniably alive. She sat in the chair by the door. She had a statement to give at 4 o'clock. She had a formal recommendation somewhere in a chain of command she wasn't in. She had 4 other case files that were now in federal hands and that would be reviewed by people whose job was to look at the distance between what the record said and what had actually happened. She had about 2 hours. She pulled out her phone. She thought about calling her agency supervisor in Helena. She'd missed several messages in the last 24 hours and owed someone an explanation. She thought about calling the number labeled with a first name she hadn't dialed in 2 years, because some of the people on the other end of that might want to know that the man in the ICU was awake and talking. She did neither. She put the phone away. She sat in the chair and she let the afternoon happen around her. The monitors, the building sounds, the occasional footstep in the corridor. And she did not construct a plan or build a strategy or map out the next 48 hours. She just sat in the room with a man who was alive because of a set of decisions and skills and years and accidents that had somehow accumulated into this particular Thursday, and she let that be enough for a minute. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it, expecting Calloway or Doss or her supervisor in Helena. It was a number she didn't recognize. Local area code this time. She answered on the second ring. "Ms. Brooks?" The voice was male, slightly formal, with the crisp diction of someone who'd rehearsed what they were going to say. "This is Ronald Vess. I'm the chair of the Redwood Valley Medical Center Board of Directors." "Yes," she said. "I understand you're still in the building," he said. "I am." "I was hoping we could speak." A pause that had the texture of something carefully calibrated. "I'd like to convey the board's position on everything that has occurred in the past 24 hours. Personally, if possible." "I have a statement scheduled at 4 o'clock, she said. "Before 4, if you can. What I have to say—" Another pause. "I think it should be said before the statement, not after." She thought about this for a moment. She thought about what a board chair wanted to say to a travel nurse that had to be said before the formal federal proceeding rather than after. She thought, he's worried. She thought, he should be. "Room 212, she said. 20 minutes. I need to arrange coverage for my patient first." She ended the call and looked at the man sleeping in the bed. His pressure was holding. He was stable. Brendan was at the station. She stood up, went to the door, and was about to push it open when she stopped. There was something wrong with the drainage bag. She turned back. She crossed to the bedside and looked at the chest tube drainage, and what she saw wasn't catastrophic, wasn't immediately alarming, but was different from what it had been 40 minutes ago. The output volume had ticked up, not dramatically, but the color had shifted slightly, and the rate had changed in a way that could mean nothing, or could mean that something in the thoracic cavity was reacting to the increased activity of the morning. Or it could mean that the diaphragm repair was under more stress than it should be. She stood at the bedside and ran the numbers in her head. She thought about the sutures. She thought about his blood pressure over the last hour. 104, but with a couple of variant spikes she'd attributed to him being less sedated and more physiologically active. She thought, or I attributed them to that because that was the most comfortable explanation. She picked up her phone and called Pellman directly. He answered in 2 rings. She described what she was seeing without framing it as certain, because it wasn't certain. It was a data point, possibly benign, possibly the beginning of something that needed to be caught early rather than late. Pellman's response was measured. He said he'd come up and look. He said it was probably nothing, but he'd look. He said probably with the same weight she'd learned to assign the word when someone experienced used it, not as reassurance, but as a calibration of uncertainty that left room for the other possibility. She hung up and stood at the bedside and looked at the drainage bag and thought about 2 hours from now, about 4 o'clock, about the board chair waiting in room 2, 1, 2 for a conversation she understood the shape of even without having heard it. And then she thought about the fact that Verna Cast had known she was here before the helicopters landed. And she thought about who else might have been told. And she thought about the board chair calling her directly, immediately, requesting a meeting before her formal statement from a local number she didn't have. And the question she hadn't thought to ask yet was, how did he get her cell number? She was still standing there, with that question sitting cold and clear in the front of her mind when the patient's monitor issued a soft alert, not the alarm cadence, but the advisory tone, the one that said, look at this rather than act now. And his blood pressure read 91/59, down from 104, dropping. She was already moving before the second advisory tone sounded, not panicking. Panic was a waste of the first 30 seconds, and the first 30 seconds were the ones that mattered. She hit the call button with her left hand while her right went to the chest tube drainage bag, checking the connection, the tubing, the seal at the insertion site. The volume shift was real. The color shift was real. And the pressure reading dropping from 104 to 91 in under 40 minutes told her that whatever was happening in his thoracic cavity had been building since at least mid-morning, and she'd attributed it to the wrong cause. Brendan came through the door. She spoke before he was fully in the room. Get Pellman up here now, not in 5 minutes. Page the on-call thoracic resident. And I need another large-bore IV kit, left arm, and a fresh drainage setup. She was at the bedside, her hand on the patient's wrist, counting. His pulse was elevated and the quality of it was wrong. Not thready yet, but heading somewhere she didn't want it to go. Move. Brendan moved. She leaned over the patient. His eyes were half open. The pressure drop had pulled him up from sleep the way the body sometimes did. Some automatic alarm system surfacing consciousness when the numbers went wrong. "I'm here," she said. "Something's going on with the drain. I'm watching it. Don't move." "What?" "Don't talk either," she said. "Save it." His jaw closed. He looked at the ceiling and breathed, deliberate and controlled, the way someone breathed when they'd been trained to manage their body under pressure. She watched his chest rise and fall and thought about the diaphragm repair and the 4 sutures she'd placed at 5 a.m. and whether the morning's activity, the consciousness, the conversation, the tension of surfacing from sedation, had put more mechanical stress on that repair than she'd accounted for. She thought, "I should have kept him quieter." She thought, "I couldn't have known exactly how active he'd be." She thought, both of those things are true, and neither one helps right now. Pellman came through the door 2 minutes after the page, which meant he'd been somewhere on this floor and had understood from Brendan's tone that 2 minutes was the acceptable maximum. He looked at the monitor, looked at the drainage bag, looked at Emily. "Diaphragm?" he said. "That's my read," she said. "The output increase started. I think it started around 11, but I flagged it at 12:30 when the color shifted. If there's a small dehiscence at the repair site, we need imaging," he said. "His pressure is going to keep dropping if we move him to imaging," she said. "I need you to look at this and tell me if we can manage it here long enough to stabilize first." This was the part of medicine that didn't exist in textbooks. The part where 2 experienced clinicians stood at a bedside and negotiated between 2 bad options and tried to find the third one that wasn't obvious. Pellman examined the insertion site, palpated gently along the left lower thorax. The patient's breath caught sharply, and Emily put a hand on his arm without looking away from Pellman's face. And then Pellman straightened and did the rapid mental calculation that Emily had been doing for the last 4 minutes. "Portable chest," he said. "I'll call it down. We stabilize here, we get the image, and then we make the call." "Agreed," she said. The next 40 minutes were not clean. They were not the kind of 40 minutes she could narrate simply later when someone asked what had happened, because what happened was a series of small decisions made in sequence, each one contingent on the last, each one carrying the weight of a man's functional recovery, if not his life. The portable chest X-ray confirmed what she'd suspected: a partial separation at the inferior edge of the diaphragm repair, small, not catastrophic, but allowing fluid migration into the pleural space at a rate that was going to compound his hemodynamics if they didn't address it. Pellman made the call to manage it conservatively. Adjust the drainage position, add a second tube, watch the pressure response over 30 minutes before escalating to surgical intervention. It was the right call. Emily thought it was the right call, and she said so, which was not nothing, and Pellman took it in the way of someone who valued the input without needing it to make the decision. At 2:15 p.m., the patient's pressure read 97/61. At 2:40, it read 103/65. At 3:10, when Pellman leaned over the monitor and then leaned back and let out a breath that he'd probably been holding in some form since noon, it read 108/70. "He's holding," Pellman said. "He's holding," Emily agreed. The patient, who had been awake and silent for most of this, awake in the way of someone who understood that the most useful thing they could contribute was to lie still and breathe, looked at the ceiling and said nothing. She checked his face. His jaw was tight. He was in pain. The conservative management approach meant less sedation to protect the repair, which meant more of whatever the afternoon felt like from inside his body. "I know," she said quietly. "You don't," he said. "No," she admitted, "but I've had patients tell me, and I've extrapolated." Something shifted in his expression that was almost humor. "You're still bossy," he said. "Still a nurse," she said. "Still the job." She stayed at the bedside until 3:30. Then she asked Brendan to cover and walked out of the ICU for the first time in 3 hours and stood in the corridor and pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. The adrenaline of the last 40 minutes was metabolizing and leaving behind the fatigue that it had been holding at bay, and she felt the full weight of the last 36 hours settle into her bones all at once. Her back ached from the OR positioning, from the ICU chair, from the specific physical toll of sustained concentration. Her eyes felt like she'd sandpapered the inside of her lids. She thought about Ronald Vess and the phone call she hadn't followed up on and the meeting in room 212 that had not happened. She thought about his question, how did he get my cell number? And the answer she'd begun constructing when the monitor had issued its advisory tone. She pushed off the wall and went to find Doss. He was in the administrative suite, where the scrambled communications terminal was still running, and Hart was at one of the laptops with the focused stillness of someone working through something complicated. Doss looked up when she came in. He read her face in the way she'd noticed he could do, efficiently, without asking. What happened? She told him. The drainage complication, the conservative management, the current stability. She kept it brief because the clinical situation wasn't why she was here. Ronald Vess called me, she said. Board chair. He wanted a meeting before my 4 o'clock statement. I agreed to it, and then the patient's monitor alerted, and I never made it. She paused. He had my cell number. I'd like to know how. Doss looked at Hart. Hart looked up from the laptop. Vess, he said, as if pulling a card from a mental file. We know that name. From the CAST investigation, Doss said. From the device log, Hart said. CAST secondary phone. One of the 6 numbers on her contact list. He paused. Number 4. The room was quiet. Emily stood in the doorway and let that reconfigure what she'd been thinking since the phone call. Vess wasn't calling because the board was worried about liability. He was calling because he was connected, directly, by phone, by an 18-month relationship with an asset who'd been planted in his hospital. And the meeting he wanted wasn't about conveying the board's position. It was about finding out what she knew before she gave a formal statement to federal investigators. Has he been interviewed yet? She said. He was scheduled for this afternoon, Doss said. Calloway's team. He was already moving toward the communications terminal. If his number is on CAST's device, it changes the interview considerably, Hart said. He was already typing. Emily thought about Vess's voice on the phone, the formal diction, the careful calibration of the pause, the specific framing of before the statement, not after. She thought about a hospital board chair who had allowed 2 nursing staff complaints about Hale's documentation practices to be archived without review. She'd learned that detail from Calloway's summary and had filed it as institutional failure, the ordinary negligence of a board too deferential to its highest credentialed staff member. She thought about it differently now. Not negligence. Cover. There's going to be more in those archived complaints, she said. If Vess knew Hale's documentation was problematic and suppressed the complaints, then Hale may not have been acting alone, Doss said. He didn't say it with satisfaction. He said it with the tired precision of a man adding a necessary piece to a picture that was already complicated. The 4 other patients, Emily said, with the documentation discrepancies. Yes. If the board knew, then it stops being a rogue physician with bad habits, Doss said, and becomes something that has a different name and carries a different set of charges. Emily stood in the doorway for another moment. She thought about 4 patients who had worse outcomes than their initial presentations warranted, and about how many people in this building had been adjacent to that information and done nothing, and about the specific architecture of institutions that protected themselves by making the cost of knowing things very high. She thought about a travel nurse who'd been in this hospital for 6 weeks and had been systematically invisible until she became inconvenient. I'm ready to give my statement, she said. Calloway met her at 4 o'clock in the same conference room they'd used the previous morning, which felt like a week ago. She was accompanied by a second investigator Emily hadn't spoken to before, a man named Reyes, quiet, who took notes by hand in a style that was nearly illegible and probably completely accurate. Emily gave her statement in 45 minutes. She didn't editorialize, she didn't characterize. She described what she had observed, in sequence, with the times she could confirm and the estimates she labeled as estimates. She described the intake presentation, her clinical assessment, the exchange with Dr. Hale, the removal from the trauma bay. She described what she'd seen on the patient's gurney that had told her what she needed to know. She described Hale's falsified documentation the way Doss had described it to her, not as her opinion, but as what the system record showed, which she'd been told about and which was verifiable independently of her account. When she finished, Calloway set down her own pen. I want to tell you something, Calloway said. It was a departure from the formal register of the interview, and both of them acknowledged it. Off the record, if you want it to be. You can keep it on the record, Emily said. Calloway nodded. Your clinical assessment, your initial assessment before you were removed from the room, was subsequently confirmed by the imaging that was eventually run. The automated vital signs confirmed it before that. The surgical findings confirmed it definitively. She paused. There is not a single piece of clinical evidence in this case that contradicts what you said at the gurney. I know, Emily said. That sounds like I'm stating the obvious, Calloway said. It doesn't, Emily said. It sounds like you're putting it in the record. Yes, Calloway said. That's what I'm doing. Emily looked at the table for a moment. She thought about the badge she'd placed on the trauma bay counter and the sound it had made. Small, definitive, the sound of a thing being set down with intention. She thought about Hale's face when he'd said you're a nurse, and how he'd meant it as an ending, and it had turned out to be something else entirely. What happens to Vess? She said. Ronald Vess is currently being interviewed in a room 2 doors down from this one, Calloway said. The content of that interview is not something I can discuss with you. What I can tell you is that the investigation has expanded, and that the archived nursing complaints are being reviewed, and that the outcome of that review will be thorough. How many people on the board knew? Emily said. That's part of what we're determining. And Hale? Beyond the hospital removal, what does the criminal investigation look like? The falsification of medical records under circumstances that resulted in delayed treatment to a critically injured patient carries significant federal exposure, Calloway said evenly. The fact that the patient is a classified asset with protected status adds additional layers. His attorney is aware of the scope. She paused. He's not going to be practicing medicine in the foreseeable future, Emily. I can say that with confidence. Emily nodded. She didn't feel the satisfaction she'd thought she might feel, hearing that sentence. She felt something more complicated. The specific, tired weight of being right about something that it would have been better not to have been right about. Because if she'd been wrong, the man upstairs would have arrived at a hospital that handled his care correctly, and everything she'd described in the last 45 minutes wouldn't have needed to happen. She felt, underneath that, something quieter, something that didn't have a clean name. Not pride, too simple, not relief, not exactly. More like the feeling of having been a particular person consistently enough that when the moment came, she'd been able to be that person without having to decide to. She stood. She shook Calloway's hand. She shook Reyes's hand. She picked up her phone and her badge and her running clinical notes, and she walked out of the conference room. A muppet. The next morning, Colonel Doss found her at the ICU station where she was reviewing the overnight numbers on the patient, who had maintained the previous afternoon's stability through the night and whose diaphragm repair was holding with the second drainage tube doing what it was supposed to do. Doss was carrying a folder. He set it on the counter. The formal recommendation went through last night, he said. She looked at the folder. She didn't open it. What is it? She said. Not a question exactly. The Army Distinguished Civilian Service Award, he said. The civilian equivalent of what would have been, if you were still in uniform, a decoration with a V device. He paused. It's the highest honor the Army can confer on a civilian. She looked at the folder for a long moment. I was doing my job, she said. I know that's what you think, he said. I'm telling you that's not sufficient to describe what you did. I know you don't need it, he said. That's not the point. The point is that what happened in this building in the last 36 hours is going into a record. The people who made decisions are going into that record. You're going into that record. And the record matters, Emily. Not for you, but for the next person who is dismissed from a room because of what their badge says instead of what their hands can do. She was quiet for a moment. Take the folder, he said. You don't have to decide anything else right now. She took the folder. He looked at the ICU door. How is he? Better than yesterday, she said. Genuinely better, which is different from the numbers being better. Can I see him? Not yet, she said. Give him until noon. Doss almost smiled. Still running the floor. I am, in fact, a nurse, she said. This is, in fact, still the job. He left. She put the folder in her bag and went back to the patient's room. On the fourth day, the board of Redwood Valley Medical Center held an emergency session that lasted 3 hours and was attended by 2 members of the federal investigation team as observers. Emily was not in the room. She was, at the time, assisting with a separate cardiac case in the ER, a 63-year-old rancher who'd driven himself to the hospital with what he described as heartburn and what turned out to be a STEMI that required the kind of fast, competent intervention that didn't make news and didn't generate commendations and was simply a human life that continued because the right person was there. She learned what happened in the board session from Sandra, who had been called in to give testimony about the archived nursing complaints, and came to find Emily afterward with the expression of someone who had needed to sit with what they'd witnessed for a few hours before they could talk about it. 3 board members resigned. Ronald Vess was among them, under the kind of circumstances that meant the resignation was not voluntary in any functional sense. The remaining board voted to formally acknowledge the institutional failures that had allowed the documentation discrepancies in Hale's files to go unaddressed, and to cooperate fully with the ongoing federal investigation, and to commission an independent clinical audit of every case in which Hale had issued a protocol override in the past 3 years. The audit, Sandra said, was going to take months. The number of cases involved was not small. "How many?" Emily said. Sandra told her. Emily looked out the window of the break room at the Stone Haven afternoon, the mountains flat and clear on the horizon, the October light low and specific. She thought about those numbers, which she was not going to say out loud because they didn't need to be said out loud. "Were you one of the nurses who filed a complaint?" she said. Sandra was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I saw things I should have filed complaints about. I didn't." She looked at her hands. I told myself it was complicated. I told myself I didn't have enough to build a case on. I told myself a lot of things." "You're telling me now," Emily said. "To federal investigators," Sandra said. 2 years too late." "Maybe," Emily said, "but the record's different now than it was. That matters." Sandra looked at her. "You don't have to make me feel better about it." "I'm not," Emily said, and she meant it plainly, and Sandra heard it that way. "I'm telling you what I think is true. The record is different, and the record matters. What you do with the next version of a situation like this is what determines the rest of it." She poured a cup of coffee from the break room machine that still tasted like hot sadness and was the best available option, and drank it at the window. "They're going to offer you a permanent position," Sandra said. "Full-time, with a title. I heard it from the acting CMO this morning." "I know," Emily said. "Are you going to take it?" Emily thought about it. She thought about the travel bag under the bed in her apartment above the laundromat. She thought about Stone Haven, which had been her 3rd placement, and which she had not, before this week, thought of as a place she was staying. She thought about the ER here, its specific rhythms, its specific population, the particular kind of trauma that came through its doors from the mountains and the roads and the weather. She thought about a clinical audit that was going to take months and the number of cases it would cover, and the institutional transformation that followed audits like that, and what that transformation required from the people who were present for it. She thought about what Doss had said, "Not for you, but for the next person." "I don't know yet," she said. And then, honestly, probably. On the 5th day, he asked to see her. Not through Brendan, not through Doss. He sent a message to the nurses' station in his own handwriting, shaky but legible, on a piece of paper that said, "Only Brooks. When you have a minute." She read it at the station and thought, "He knows I don't have minutes," and went immediately. He was sitting up. Not all the way, 30 degrees, the kind of progress that looked modest and represented significant physical work. The color in his face was different from the first time she'd seen it on the gurney. He looked like a person rather than a physiological emergency. She sat in the chair by the bed. "Doss told me about the award," he said. "Doss talks too much," she said. "He talks exactly the right amount," he said. "Are you going to accept it?" "I haven't decided." "Accept it," he said. "That's easy for you to say." "It is," he agreed. "I'm not the one who has to stand in front of people and be told I did something right. I know that's harder than it sounds for people like He stopped. People like what? She said. People who spend enough years in environments where being acknowledged for the thing you did correctly means someone is deciding whether to blame you for how it happened. She looked at him. I'm not wrong, he said. No, she said. You're not. He looked at the window. Stonehaven was doing what it did on clear October days, presenting itself as the kind of place that looked like a photograph of somewhere you should probably appreciate more than you currently do. I've been trying to think about how to say something, he said, for a couple of days. You don't have to say anything. I know I don't have to, he said. That's not why I'm saying it. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing words that will have to be accurate because they won't get another opportunity to say them correctly. I know what it cost you to speak up in that room. I know what it cost you to keep speaking up after they told you to stop. I know what it looked like from the outside. A travel nurse making noise in someone else's trauma bay. He paused. And I know that none of that is what it actually was. But you didn't have any way to prove that in the moment. You just had to. I just had to be right, she said. Yeah. He looked at her. Thank you. She looked back at him for a long moment. She thought about what thank you actually contained in this specific context. The weight of the 11 people on a team who were safe partly because this man was alive to provide information. The weight of a warning delivered in semi-conscious fragments that had been understood because of what she'd been trained to know. The weight of a classified operation that had folded into her ordinary Thursday in a hospital in Montana. You would have made it, she said, because she believed that needed to be said too. The surgical team was there. Dr. Yoon was there. The intervention would have happened, later than it should have, with more risk than was necessary, but it would have happened. You don't know that. No, she admitted, but I'm not going to let you spend your recovery deciding you owe me your life. He almost smiled. Too late, he said. Then spend it however you want, she said. But don't let it be a debt. Things worked out the way they worked out. People did their jobs. I did mine. She stood up. You need to rest. You're doing too much talking for someone with a 4-day-old diaphragm repair. You're still going to manage this floor, he said. Until someone tells me to stop, she said. And given recent events, whoever tries that is going to have a significantly worse morning than they anticipated. She went to the door. She paused there, not because there was something more to say, but because she wanted to look at him one more time. Not as a patient, not as a clinical situation, but as a person who had surfaced from something serious and was still here. Take care of yourself, she said. After. You too, he said. She went back to work. 3 weeks later, Redwood Valley Medical Center issued a formal public statement of institutional apology. Not the kind that legal teams draft to minimize exposure, though that language was in there too, because institutions were institutions. The substantive portion acknowledged the clinical failures, the suppressed complaints, the documentation falsification, and the wrongful removal of a staff member who had been correct in her assessment and professional in her conduct. Marcus Hale's medical license was suspended pending the outcome of a criminal proceeding that his attorney had, according to Sandra, described privately as complicated. The 4-word version of complicated, in this context, meant that the evidence was clear and the exposure was significant, and the man who had once run the trauma surgery department at Redwood Valley Medical Center was not going to run anything for a long time. Ronald Vess and 2 other board members resigned under circumstances that were public, consequential, and included their own separate legal considerations. The board that replaced them commissioned not only the clinical audit, but an external review of governance practices, which was less dramatic than criminal charges, and would ultimately matter more, because it was the audit that would determine what happened in the next version of a situation like this one and the one after that. Emily accepted the permanent position. She did it without drama. She told the acting CMO yes in a break room conversation that lasted 4 minutes and then went back to the floor because there were 3 patients waiting and the timing of career decisions was irrelevant to their specific problems. She did it partly because she was tired of the logistics of being a travel nurse, and partly because Stonehaven was a place that apparently fit inside her in a way she hadn't anticipated, and partly because of what Doss had said about what the record was for. Partly because of the 43-year-old woman from Kalispell who came into the ER 6 days after the patient was transferred out, and who sat in the waiting room for 2 hours before Emily looked at her face across the room and thought something is wrong and went to her and turned out to be right, and the fact that Emily being right that day cost nothing and required no helicopters and no federal investigation and no formal apology from any institution. It just required her to be there and to pay attention and to refuse to let someone's presentation be the whole story. That was the job. That had always been the job. She accepted the Distinguished Civilian Service Award on a Saturday in November in a room that was smaller than such occasions usually warranted and that she had specifically requested be kept small. Doss was there, a few people from her former unit who had gotten word through channels she didn't fully understand. Sandra, who cried and was embarrassed about crying and cried anyway. The acting CMO. Brendan, who had taken the day off for it and looked slightly uncomfortable in clothes that weren't scrubs. The citation was read by a colonel she didn't know, who read it well and without excess. It described the events without classifying what couldn't be classified, and it was accurate as far as it went, and it did not capture what the morning had actually felt like from the inside. The exhaustion, the coffee that tasted like nothing, the specific quality of being ignored, the exact sound her badge had made on the counter. It wasn't supposed to capture those things. Awards weren't memory, they were record. That was the distinction Doss had made, and he'd been right about it. She stood in the front of that small room and received the award with both hands and said thank you and said nothing else, because she had learned that the moment an occasion like this one became about the speech was the moment it stopped being about the thing. Later, when most people had left, Doss stood with her near the window in that same way he'd stood in ICU rooms and conference rooms and administrative corridors over the last 3 weeks, present without demanding the space. "You could come back," he said, "if you ever wanted to." "To the Army," she said, "or to an adjacent role. There are roles for people with your—" He paused, choosing. "Particular skill set." She thought about it honestly. She thought about the photograph in her wallet and the people in it, and what she would be going back toward, and what she would be leaving. "I'm going to stay here for a while," she said. He nodded. "I thought you would. But you asked anyway." "I'm obligated to ask," he said. "And I wanted to." She looked out at Stonehaven in November. The early dark, the mountains gone to silhouette, the lights of the town coming on in the early evening, the way lights always came on, the way they'd been coming on in places like this for as long as people had been keeping each other warm against the dark. "Tell him I said he needs to do his physical therapy," she said. Doss looked at her. "He's not going to like that message." "He doesn't have to like it," she said. "It's medically accurate." She drove home to the apartment above the laundromat on Clover Street. She made coffee that was significantly better than anything the hospital had to offer. She sat at the window and looked at the fog against the glass, which was what November fog in Montana did. It pressed against things, looking for a way in. She thought about the last month, not as a story she was telling, not organized into the kind of shape that made it comprehensible from the outside, but as the raw experience of having been present for it. The exhaustion, the frustration of being looked through by a man who read her badge and decided that was sufficient, the specific loneliness of being right in a room where no one was listening. The moment the monitor had issued its advisory tone and she'd stood at the bedside and made the decision to act, not because she was certain of the outcome, but because the alternative was being the person who didn't. She thought about what she'd told Sandra. The record is different and the record matters. She thought about what it costs to be the person who refuses to let a wrong thing stand just because standing is easier. She thought about it not as heroism. Heroism was a story you told afterward, and she was suspicious of how clean those stories always got, but as a series of ordinary choices made under pressure by an imperfect person who happened to have the right training in the right place on the wrong day. She thought about the next shift, about the ER, which would be its ordinary chaos tomorrow, the ice road accidents and the hunting injuries and the cardiac events, and the 3-day-old infections and the people who'd driven themselves in because they didn't have anyone else to take them. She thought about walking through those doors with a permanent badge and a changed record, and the knowledge that the institution around her was in the process of becoming something different, not because institutions transformed easily, but because enough people had been forced to look at what this one had been and decide they weren't willing to return to it. She thought, this is where you are. This is what you do. She finished the coffee. She looked at the fog. Outside her window, Stonehaven was a town of ordinary people moving through an ordinary evening, most of them unaware that anything significant had happened in the building at the edge of town, most of them not needing to know. That was fine. That was how it was supposed to work. The people who kept others alive rarely needed to be the headline. They needed to be there when the ambulance doors opened and the clock started, and the difference between 9 minutes and 3 minutes was the whole question. They needed to be the kind of person who put their badge down quietly and walked out and came back when they were needed. They needed to know what they knew and refused to pretend otherwise. Emily Brooks had been all of those things, imperfectly, stubbornly, without waiting for permission. She had not been thanked for most of it, and she had not required thanks for most of it, and she had not been thanked until the moment mattered enough that the thanks meant something. And now she had a badge with a permanent designation and a record that told the truth, and a patient somewhere in a rehabilitation facility doing physical therapy he probably resented, and a town that needed an ER nurse who paid attention. She set down her coffee cup. She had an early shift.